Welcome to Mind Tricks Radio, where we'll explore contemporary topics in psychology through interviewing creative and innovative thinkers in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan. Thanks for tuning in. We're here today with philosopher Dr. Iddo Landau. Dr. Landau grew up and lived most of his life in Israel. He currently teaches philosophy at University of Haifa, where he focuses mostly on the philosophy of meaning of life, existentialism, and ethics. Dr. Landau also has worked for many years with the terminally ill cancer patients under the auspices of the Israel Cancer Association. He is the author of Finding Meaning in an Imperfect World. Iddo, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Wow. So Finding Meaning in an Imperfect World. What an amazing read. I really enjoyed reading your book. I know it's a few years old now, but I discovered it. And honestly, I read it twice and just each time just absorbed so much information. I think I could read it 10 more times and still get a lot out of the book. So congratulations on that. And thank you for just writing a brilliant piece of work.
Thank you so much for that. I'm very glad that you liked the book.
So I know when we originally set up this interview, you were asking me, well, I'm a philosopher, and how is this going to relate to a psychology podcast? And I was explaining to you that in my clinical practice, these issues, these existential issues of meaning of life and purpose, they come up all the time. It's not necessarily like, Dr. Kaplan, what's the meaning of life? But they come up in one way or another. And I just found that talking with a philosopher about some of these reasons why people have a hard time finding meaning would be a very meaningful podcast episode. So that's why we're here. And I'm really happy to have you on the show for that. To start with, we'll delve deeply into this topic, but I'd like to get to know you a little bit as a person first, briefly, just to understand who you are as a person, how you became a philosopher, and importantly, how you became interested on these issues of existentialism and meaning, like how that came about for you.
So I think that the beginning was in high school when one of my teachers, a history teacher, talked a lot from time to time about philosophical issues. And that made me very interested in questions such as, do we have free will? And what is justice? And what is morality? And also, is life meaningful, and how could life become more meaningful? And this led me, when I went to college, to university, to focus on philosophy. And with time, my interests grew even stronger, and finally I became a philosopher.
I'm just kind of curious because you grew up in Israel sort of in the 1950s, shortly after World War II. I'm just curious whether what had happened during World War II and the Holocaust and all of that, like that must have been affecting the way people in Israel were thinking about these issues of these existential issues about meaning. I'm just wondering if that had anything to do with your interest in the area.
Very much so. Most of the grown-ups in my neighborhood, and some family members as well, were Holocaust survivors, and some of them had very difficult stories. And I was very impressed as a child and then as a teenager by the fact that although they went through terrible, terrible things, and many of them lost their families completely, I saw how many of them succeeded in continuing to have a meaningful life and a happy life as well. And that impressed me very much and led me to think a lot about good and evil, and also about the ability of people, even in extremely hard circumstances, to heal themselves and to grow and to mend wounds and continue to live well. That made a very strong impression on me.
Yeah, I'm sure. In your book, you talk a lot about, in the beginning, especially the early chapters, this concept of value. And I get the sense that understanding value and what value means plays a very important role in the concept of finding meaning in one's life. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what value is exactly and how one evaluates that and assesses the meaning of that for oneself.
So I think that value has both objective and subjective aspects. And it is very important that we'll ask ourselves which aspects of the objective value we connect with. Different people have different ways of linking with different aspects of objective value, just as different people need different medications for different illnesses, or different people are sensitive to some types of beauty and not to others, or to some types of art and not to others. The value is the thing that we find of worth or importance, the things that we look up to, and the things that we have that we would like to have more of in our lives. And these are things that we not only desire, which sometimes can be not valuable, but that we also respect, that we look at as having positive worth to it.
One thing that you talked about was that actually meaning can also exist on a continuum. It's not a present or absent thing. What is meant by that?
Unfortunately, many people who feel that their lives are not meaningful have a very binary, black and white, all or nothing view about meaning of life. They think that lives are either fully meaningful or that they're completely empty of meaningfulness. And that is probably untrue. In many other aspects of value, we see that there is a continuum. Things are not absolutely beautiful or absolutely ugly. People are not absolutely rich or absolutely desolate financially. Things are not completely interesting or completely dull. There's a continuum. And since meaning of life is based on value, we have good reasons to believe that this is also true of meaning in life. I think is important to remember, because once we understand that even if we feel or think that our lives are not meaningful, it may be that they do not have zero meaningfulness, but they have quite a lot of meaningfulness, perhaps, but maybe not enough. Maybe it didn't pass the threshold. We can build on the meaningfulness that we do have in life and just enhance it so it would pass the threshold. We already have some. We don't have to begin from scratch. And we can also learn from the meaningfulness that we do have, that we're happy with, what works for us, what we do take to be meaningful.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about that with a black and white way of looking, an all or nothing way, because in a psychotherapy practice, it's not uncommon for people to have very rigid ways of thinking and experience things. And as a psychotherapist, we're often working to try to break the rigidity of patterns of thinking of things as all or nothing. So it's interesting to talk about that with meaningfulness on a continuum, because it's sort of consistent with that kind of idea.
Very interesting. I didn't know that this is very common in psychotherapy.
Yeah, and similarly, as well as the continuum part, you mentioned that meaning could shift for a person over time, right?
Yes, I think this is also something that some people miss. Some people think that if you have meaning in life, then you focus on one thing and you focus on it for your whole life, for, I don't know, since you're 20 until you pass away. And if you change it from time to time, then something is wrong, then your life is not meaningful. And that is probably not correct, as again, we can see from other spheres of value. We know that people can enjoy various types of art, and people can also find value and meaning both in art and, I don't know, in family life and philanthropic work. And it is, I think, very important to see that things can change. Sometimes we have very good friends and maybe terrible thing happened and they passed away, or maybe it just cooled down. And we have new friends, or maybe we're very interested in one thing and then we become interested in another thing. The fact that we're now interested in another thing does not show that we're not really interested in the previous things, or that the earlier friendships were not good. No, they were also good, and now we have new ones. I think it is perfectly plausible for a person. I don't know, if to give some kind of a schematic example, a person might be interested in doing philanthropic work in a third world country from the age, I don't know, from 20 to 35, and then raising hopefully decent and happy children from 35 to 55, and then maybe writing good literature from 55, I don't know, to 65, and then just to continue this example, maybe meditate in a monastery for the rest of their lives, and this would be a meaningful life. So it is perfectly okay to change from one sphere to another. Maybe it's also good because things become fresh and sometimes we exhaust a certain sphere of meaning or source of meaning in our life.
I like the way that you describe that, Iddo. It makes a lot of sense that people can do one thing at one time in their life and have meaning from it and then shift to something else, but it doesn't invalidate the previous meaning. You're just moving on to something else. And that's part of the flexibility of life, I guess. So I really like that way of looking at it. You know, you talk about, there's several arguments that you go through and you write like a philosopher. So it's very fascinating to see how you take an argument and you deconstruct it and discuss why it's not really valid from a philosophical point of view. And I want to talk about some of them because they are actually the kinds of things that we hear in the psychotherapy practice, believe it or not. They may not be worded quite like a philosophical statement, but the issues themselves come up. And so I think it would be worthwhile to take a look at some of them. One of them you talk about the idea of perfectionism. And like if I were thinking about meaning or lack of meaning from that point of view, I might say something like, hey, I don't have any extraordinary talents. I'm not accomplishing great things in my life. I'm not standing out as an example of, a celebrity or I'm just not like fulfilling that. So what's the point of life if I can't be this great remembered person for for doing these great things? Like, how would you argue against that from a philosophical point of view?
Well, I think that various considerations suggest that this perfectionist attitude is problematic. And I have to say that many people with whom I talked about their life's meaning and told me that they feel that their lives are not meaningful or not meaningful enough, actually expressed this perfectionist sentiment. They thought that if they're not as great as, I don't know, Shakespeare or Einstein or I don't know, Churchill or Nietzsche or Freud, then their lives are meaningless. There are those celebrities, so to say, or eminent people, and then all the rest. We are all, I know, the riffraff. Well, not really. We don't have meaningful lives just because we're not that important. I think that various arguments can be presented, considerations can be presented against this perfectionist sentiment. One of them has to do with consistency. Most of us, most of the time, do not accept perfectionist arguments. We do not think that if we're not as rich as, I don't know, Bill Gates or whoever, Jeff Bezos, then we're downtrodden poor. And we don't think that if we don't live in the most beautiful city in the world, our city must be repulsive and not worth living in. Or that we're stupid if we're not Einstein. We can be not Einstein, but clever enough. Or that we're villains if we're not Mother Teresa. But then when it comes to meaning in life, inconsistently, these people who reject perfectionism in all other spheres of life sometimes accept it when it comes to life's meaning. And so under pain of inconsistency, maybe if we reject with good reasons perfectionism in other spheres of life, so we should do also when it comes to meaning in life. And a second consideration also has a bit to do with consistency. This is now the inconsistency between our attitude to dear ones, or even people who are not dear ones, who are also not Einsteins or Freuds or whoever. And we don't think that their lives are meaningless. We think that their lives are quite important and meaningful. And if something bad happens to them, even people we don't know, maybe a child that we read about in the paper. Well, just like us, he too or she too is not Einstein or Shakespeare or Rembrandt. But when we hear that something bad happened to them, we're very sorry about that. And we think that something very valuable was harmed. But if that is true of them, then it is probably also true of us. If their lives are meaningful, even if they're not Shakespeare, then maybe our lives are meaningful, even if we too are not Shakespeare. It is interesting that sometimes when we talk about discrimination, usually when we talk about discrimination, especially in political contexts, we think of discrimination as cases in which we treat ourselves more leniently, or we look at ourselves as better than other people. We have double standards, and the standard for us is a better standard for other people. But it is interesting to see that when we come to meaning in life, it is very common for us to discriminate against ourselves. What we allow other people, for example, we think that they have meaningful lives, even if they are not Einsteins, we do not allow ourselves. So that is another argument from inconsistency. And a third consideration is a consideration from implausibility. Usually we refrain from criticism based on implausible expectations. When someone admires a certain dog, we do not point out in response that the dog cannot drive. Why? Because it is implausible to expect the dog to drive. And we do not disapprove of chairs because we cannot make a nice cup of tea with a chair. And we do not criticize kettles because it is inconvenient to sit on them. But it is so strange to criticize ourselves and other people for not being those personalities. There might be 10 or 50 or maybe 100 Einsteins or Rembrandts, maybe less than that, in the whole history of humanity. And yes, we're not one of them. So maybe these standards are simply implausible. And if they're implausible, maybe we should reject them. Another consideration has to do with simple cruelty. I think that often holding perfectionist standards when evaluating the meaning of our lives is cruel. Now, it sounds weird to say that about people who are sometimes very kind. They just feel that their lives are meaningless. But I think we should remember that cruelty is frequently object-specific. One can be cruel to one's children, but not to one's employees, and vice versa, or to one child, but not to another. And I think that by the same token, many people who see their lives as meaningless are compassionate towards other people, but cruel to themselves. And we could identify this cruelty if we heard them talking to others in the way that they talk to themselves. If they talk to other people in such a way, if they said things, well, you're not wise as Aristotle, hence you're an idiot and I despise you, or you're not talented as Mozart, you're just one big zero, you don't write like Shakespeare, you're rubbish. If we heard them talking like that, we'd say, oh, this is a very, very cruel way to speak with people. But what is forbidden in the general social world, for some reason, is accepted in the private self-talk. And I think that cruelty is bad or terrible always, and we shouldn't talk like that to people. And we too are people. Yes. Again, we see here a kind of, discrimination against ourselves, in the sense that we allow things to happen to ourselves that we would not morally allow to happen to other people.
Sure. And when we assign perfectionistic needs for meaning, that we're really holding our own standards for ourselves to this high standard that's just going to be impossible to reach for most people. And so by expecting oneself to reach that standard and not being able to do it, and telling oneself and beating up on oneself because of that, is pretty cruel.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I think so. I think that another consideration against perfectionism is that often it is based on narcissism. And again, it may sound wrong or odd to say that because people who think that their lives are meaningless often despise themselves or have very bad feelings towards themselves. So how would that be narcissistic? But I think that rejecting oneself because one is not Einstein can in fact issue from great conceit. The process that leads to this self-loathing has to do with adoption of very high or even impossible standards for oneself. And this is frequently done in conjunction with an attitude that those others, the riffraff or the hoi polloi, may continue with their inferior standards, but if they so wish. But I endorse mine. For me, it's either Shakespeare or nothing.
Yeah.
And that has to do, I think, often with smugness. I think that some people who feel that their lives are meaningless are simply very sorry that they're not Shakespeare's or Einstein's or Freud's. And that might be a bit narcissistic.
In your book, you talk about this idea of annihilation and death and how this concept, and I can get this, like, we all know that we are mortal and we're going to die someday and we'll cease to exist. And I suppose even 4 billion years from now, the sun will expand and gobble up the earth, and then the earth will be gone. So even if we're buried in a nice plot in Haifa, that's going to be gone. How do you address that concept of like, well, it's all going to end someday and I'm going to be gone, so what's the point?
I think that death and annihilation do diminish the meaning of life a bit. And if things were different, it might have been better, though I should say that not all people would have liked to live forever or to exist forever. When they're faced with this option, some people say that they would prefer not to continue on and on. I think that here too, the sentiment that says that because we will die and be annihilated one day and also be forgotten, life is completely meaningless, is again perfectionist. Even if it would be better, and I'm not sure it would be better, but even if it would be better to live forever, this does not mean that living for some time, several decades, living well for some time is worthless, or that it is not meaningful. That the fact that our lives have been of worth at a certain point of time, this has an eternal status. It will always be true that you had a close, trustful, and blissful moment with a family member, or that you felt some exhilaration while reading a poem, or that you were a decent person, or that you had a meaningful life. Even if when we are gone and forgotten, the fact will continue to ever. But the important thing, I think, is even if finitude diminishes value, it does not remove it completely. And we can see that the fact that for some time things were meaningful for us, we had a good, meaningful life, is very important. It is very valuable. Not everything has to continue forever in order to be sufficiently valuable.
I wonder if an argument can be made that knowing that time is finite could actually create some sense of meaning, because you're not taking time for granted, that you are recognizing the importance of the time that you have and trying to be as focused and aware of how to derive meaningfulness from it because it's finite.
I think that this is a very fruitful direction. I think that for many people, if life went on and on, then perhaps life would have been less meaningful, because they might have felt that whatever they wanted to do, which is valuable, they could always do some other day. Now that we're given a limited supply of something, then we have the feeling that we have to use it well, that we shouldn't waste it. There is a saying that I mentioned in the book. This is not the dress rehearsal.
Yeah.
This is the thing in itself. We have one and only one chance to live. And we should try not to waste this. And it is easy to waste it and always prepare for something else or just not to do anything without it. The fact that we know that we have a limited time, just as you said, I think, can make or help us have a more meaningful life.
Yeah, I can't think of anything offhand, but I know that there's been a lot of movies that I've watched in the past, maybe some about vampires who are immortal and live forever. Of course, they can only come out at nighttime, so that doesn't sound like too much fun. Or other kinds of science fiction themes having to do with immortality. And I think a lot of times in those kinds of films, the issue or topic that's often wrestled with is sort of like meaninglessness. Like I'm getting up and I'm doing the same thing day after day after day, and there's no end in sight. And so they often end up just finding ways to amuse or entertain themselves that's sort of meaningless, but they can't think of anything else to do. And that's often like becomes sort of like the theme of the movie in a way, the characters struggle or conflict.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Well, similar to the death and annihilation, these are very uplifting, I have to say. I'm just joking. We get into the context of the whole universe. This idea, and I hear this sometimes, like, hey, the cosmos are so huge, and I'm just a speck of irrelevant nothingness in the greater cosmos. So why does my life have any meaning? And especially as like we're becoming more aware of cosmology and we have the tools to look out into the universe, like really like it. And I know you've probably done this, sort of pondering like the minute size of us in the grand scheme of the universe is sort of overwhelming and makes you feel kind of like you're nothing.
Right. I think that there are several possible replies to this worry that I too am familiar with. One is that if the universe is empty, we're not sure that it's empty, but if it's mostly made of dead matter, then actually we're very significant. We're very meaningful because we are in the whole huge, nothingness, or I don't know, just dead matter. We are intelligent beings that can do good things and can have aesthetic experiences and can feel warmth and friendship and do intellectual work. So we're very, very meaningful.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Because there's nothing else there. Another question is whether we would really be that interested in impacting all the universe. I, for one, do not feel any difficulty with the fact that I don't influence some, hill of sand on planet Pluto, or not to say much more distant stars in other galaxies. Maybe a thought experiment can help here. Let's assume as a thought experiment that the world or the solar system, Earth or the solar system, became 100 times bigger while the rest of the cosmos remained as it is. Would we feel that our lives are more meaningful? I don't think so. Or let's say that the whole of the universe, 90% of the universe vanished for some reason, or 95, but the solar system remained. Would then our lives become more meaningful? I don't think that they would. Mm-hmm. And again, I want to return to perfectionism, which is at the basis of so many questions and thoughts and feelings that life is meaningless. Maybe if we could influence the whole cosmos, our lives would have been more meaningful. I just suggested that maybe not, but maybe they would be. This does not mean that being a good friend and helping some people in the neighborhood and enjoying poetry or enjoying a good film is not meaningful enough. Mm-hmm. Again, we should ask ourselves whether we're not thinking ourselves here not only as Einstein or Freud, but as God. Since we're not God, in Western tradition, only God influences the whole cosmos.
Yes.
And saying that, because we're not God, our lives are not meaningful, that may be endorsing too ambitious norms.
Sure. So there's really nothing to say that having a meaningful impact on one person is any worse than having a meaningful impact on planet Xenon 41 light years from here. It's just helping somebody and being there and finding meaning for it that's important, regardless of the quantity of people who are being helped. So to think that quantity is almost utilitarian in a way, like the more of something makes it more significant, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case for meaning.
I perfectly agree. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I think it's also interesting to ask why some people are so interested in impacting or affecting all sorts of things. Look, I'm now in Haifa and you're in Hawaii, and I think that there's someone in Hawaii now eating maybe supper, and I am not influencing them now.
Right.
So I'm not. I don't feel this urge to influence everyone. I don't even feel the urge to influence my neighbors. If they have a good life, that's great. Then why should I intervene? If there is some suffering, I would be happy if the suffering would cease, would stop. But I want the suffering to stop, not necessarily that I will be the one who stops it. So I don't think that we should have this, or that we need have this urge to influence distant stars or whatever.
Yeah. So I want to move on to another one, and we could probably spend hours talking about this one. So let's just see if we can touch upon it, because it's huge. It's this idea of relativism, and you sometimes hear nihilistic people talking about this. It's sort of this idea like, well, either I have to accept that there's like an objective truth or not, and if there's no objective truth, then sort of what's the point of everything? Like I get to make up what's true and what's meaningful. And so if I'm just making it up, then how does it have any objective meaning to it? Like it's all relative. So who cares what I do? Actually, I could go out and start murdering people and it doesn't matter because it's all relative. And that's sort of relativism, and it can kind of descend into the absurd when we talk about it. But how do we put that in perspective in terms of just understanding like meaning?
Well, there's a lot of literature on objective meaning and subjective meaning. I think that the case for objective meaning is also strong. So one reply to subjectivism or relativism about life's meaning is to say that actually we probably can also identify objective meaning. But let's say that we cannot. I'm not sure that everything is lost. We can see, I think, a lot of value also in subjective meaning. Let's assume that there is only subjective meaning. So we can think of some things that have subjective meaning which can make life meaningful. Many of our friendships or maybe our loves have a strong subjective element to them. I love my children, for example, not because I surveyed all the children in the neighborhood and found objectively who's, I know, the nicest or the cleverest, but right. Just because of this arbitrary fact that they're my children. And I have some pictures from my childhood and also some things that used to belong to my parents, and they are very valuable. For me, they have sentimental value, and it's real value. It makes my life meaningful in some ways, and this is also subjective. And in general, maybe we can treat meaningfulness according to subjective paradigms. So the sensation of meaningfulness, maybe the realization of meaningfulness without thinking about objective meaningfulness, as we sometimes treat, for example, interest or maybe taste, even gastronomic taste. So some things are pleasant for us to taste and some things are bitter or unpleasant, and we try to taste the pleasant ones. And this is what we should do, and that's the right thing to do. And maybe that should be also true of what makes our lives be filled with sensed meaningfulness.
Yeah, I know I get into the argument with my wife all the time about whether mushrooms are enjoyable to eat or not, and she loves them and I can't stand them. but there's no right or wrong answer to whether or not either of us find value and meaning in eating mushrooms. And I know in my clinical practice, Iddo, like when this comes up, like I oftentimes with my patients, when we have this kind of conversation, I try to help them find and define for themselves what their own meaning is, that rather than trying to apply like an objective thing there, we talk about like, well, what would bring you meaning? Let's figure out what subjectively what that is for you. It doesn't have to be what it is for anybody else. And that seems to often be helpful. So I think that's sort of along the lines of what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. I didn't know that this is what is done often in psychotherapy.
Yeah. Well, I told you there's a lot of overlap with your subject matter.
Yeah, I now see that.
It's very important. A few more here. If I don't have a concrete goal in my life, how can my life have any meaning? Like I should be having something I'm working toward, like a big finale, something that I can say, hey, this is my grand opus here.
I know that many people have this feeling, and just as I think that we can change the sources of meaning and value in our lives, and that we can have many of them, and we don't have to have only one, even at a certain time, and certainly not all through life. This, I think, is also true of the goal of life. Generally speaking, I think we can, or we should remember that value theory in philosophy distinguishes between instrumental value and terminal or intrinsic value. So some things have value as instruments. For example, the fridge in my house has only instrumental value. I keep it only because it keeps the food fresh. And if there were another way of keeping the food fresh, I wouldn't keep the fridge. Mm-hmm. But happiness or meaningfulness, or having a happy life or having a meaningful life, this is not instrumental for other things. This is what is called in value theory intrinsic value or final value. And I think that we can see the goal of life, if we really need a goal to which we are or our life is an instrument to, we can see it as having a meaningful life or a fulfilled life or a happy life. It's also okay, I guess, for people to find such a goal to which their lives would be instrument. I don't know, maybe a moral goal, a social goal. But I think we can also treat our lives themselves as a goal, or the meaningfulness or the happiness, the well-being of our lives as a goal, and go with that.
Yeah, what you were talking about before is what you refer to in your book as the paradox of the end. I think like when somebody actually does have this major goal that they're working toward and they attain it, and then they can be like, well, now what? Like my life just lost all of its meaning because I had this one thing and I accomplished it and that's it.
Yeah. Many people come and tell me that they feel that life is meaningless because they try very hard to achieve something. And then when they achieved it, they feel empty again. So what was the use of trying to achieve that thing? And then not only the achievement, but even the road to the achievement, the effort becomes meaningless. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is true of some cases, but not all. I think that many goals do not become trivial or uninteresting or unworthy once we achieve them. Many people continue to feel the value of achievements such as raising children who are decent and happy, or having satisfying personal encounters with other people, or succeeding to do something moral and help other people. I think that there are many differences between people. Some people are more vulnerable to this, what might be called the paradox of the end, than other people. And it doesn't have to do with any metaphysical necessity, but mostly with maybe a kind of a psychological tendency or a psychological makeup. Sometimes I think it has to do with education that pressed us, usually with very good intentions, not to be sufficiently happy with our achievements. Maybe some of our educators, parents, or teachers fear that we'll be too happy or too content, and we will not continue to try hard and achieve more things. And some people are also educated to be very diligent and industrious, and that's very good in many ways. But some people can be educated too well for that, and then they feel restless. They achieve something, and then the voices from their childhood will continue to get another thing. That's not good enough yet.
Yeah.
Try to achieve more, continue to pester them. And for this reason, sometimes they are not happy with what they achieved, and they cannot sit and enjoy it to the end.
Yeah, I think that that's very common to see people who have internalized messages, mostly in their childhood, that nothing is really quite good enough. And so any achievement is just not adequate. It's what's the next thing after this, because this in and of itself is it's just not good enough. And what I hear you talking about when you're discussing this, it's another concept in psychotherapy that comes up a lot. It's this idea of like focusing more on the process of how you're getting from point A to point B, rather than the product of getting to point B, because the value is really in the process. It's in the journey. The destination doesn't really feel that meaningful if you don't have a journey to get there. So then the journey itself is what's important, I think. And
very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what we're talking about here with this idea of just focusing on the destination or fulfilling that goal. Human evil, Iddo. How can how can the world and the universe have meaning with Hitlers and Nazis running around, or Pol Pots, or Rwanda genocides? Like, this isn't a world that I want to live in. Like, it's just meaningless when you see this kind of absolute horribleness and evilness of humanity, and let alone tsunamis that kill 300,000 people who are unsuspecting. Yes. How do we even talk about meaning in light of that?
Yes, I think that this is a big problem, but there are a few things that we should remember. One of them, I think, is that there is also a lot of good in the world. I think that it is also good to remember that the main source of knowledge that we have about the world, which is the newspapers, is biased. Newspapers write much more about negative events than about positive ones. They emphasize the bad and not the good.
Yeah.
Increases in unemployment receive bigger headlines and the front pages, and decreases in unemployment do not.
Yeah.
The paper does not record 50 cases in which someone helped an old person to cross the street, right, but does record the one case in which the, so to say, helper ran away with the senior citizen's money. So we should remember that also, that there is a bias in the newspapers here, not a political bias, to left or right, but in almost all newspapers towards the evil. Yeah. But I think that we should also remember that in general, that yes, we should not deny it, the world is terrible. And we should also not deny the fact that the world is wonderful. Both statements are true.
Yeah.
And the world includes evil, injustice, pain, and cruelty and frustration, but also beauty and kindness and friendship and dedication and courage, inspiration and human closeness and warmth and justice and generosity. And we will be hurt by the evil parts often. And we can gain much and add to the good parts of the world. And I think it's true that some people completely ignore the evil and painful aspects of reality, pretending to themselves that they do not exist. And this is not good. I think we should be aware of them. But many others, I think, make a similar mistake by ignoring all the positive aspects of reality, or the possibility of enhancing the positive aspects of reality. And just as we try to further ourselves away from people who are unpleasant, we do not try to befriend them, and we try to befriend nice people. Generally speaking, I think we should acknowledge the fact that there are some very terrible things happening. There is a terrible aspect of the world, and try to enhance and connect with those aspects of the world which are good and wonderful, and they're very valuable, and we can gain very much from them.
I think that's very, very important advice, and that people have a choice in where and how they focus their energy and their attention. And you're right, like given, well, I don't know what the news is like in Israel, but you're obviously familiar with the US media, and you were right. It's a consumerist commercial media circus in the US. And I think, the mainstream media is all about getting people to watch, and they tend to watch sensationalized stuff because that holds people's attention. But that is only one side of the story, right? It kind of like what we were talking about earlier, this idea of like black and white thinking about how one sees the world. That's also can be the case with seeing the world as totally evil or totally good. There's lots of shades of gray in there.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I perfectly agree. Yes.
I want to touch on one more thing before we move on to the next part that I want to talk with you about. This is this idea of psychological egoism. And that stuck out when I was reading your book, because that does come up from time to time. It's sort of an odd thing. And the way I understand it is this idea that some people sort of undermine their altruism and generosity by convincing themselves that at the end of the day, I'm only doing it for me. Like if I'm generous to somebody or I'm altruistic, it makes me feel good. So I'm not really doing it for somebody else. I'm doing it for me. So kind of what's the point? It's all selfish. And I just wonder if you'd say a few words about that, because that's sort of fascinating.
I think that a few things might be said here. One of them is that even if we would accept this egoistic urge and say that and accept that it is present in everything, it doesn't mean that things are that bad, because wanting to feel good with oneself is not such a terrible thing. It's a good thing, I think. But I'm also not sure that we have a good argument that would show that the only or ultimate motivation in our actions is this egoistic urge. I think we can accept that an egoistic urge, perhaps, I'm not even sure of that, is also present in everything we do, without accepting that it is the only or ultimate motivating force behind our activities. There may well be also other basic and ultimate urges or motivations beside it, and some of them are worthy and some are unworthy. And one reason to think that the latter suggestion is the correct one is that even if all people have this egoistic urge, we see that some people find egoistic satisfaction in sadistic murders, and other people find egoistic satisfaction in saving lives or painting pictures or reading poems. So the difference is probably has to do with the fact that except of this egoistic urge, we have also urges for good or beauty or for bad and ugliness. And they are also very important, and we should, I think, congratulate ourselves when we're motivated by the good ones. There is no reason to think that the good or bad urges are all reducible only to the selfish ones. They are also there. We can also think about it, I think, that way. Let us assume for a second that what I just said is incorrect, and the ultimate motivation is only an egoistic one. The fact that some people satisfy this egoistic urge by doing worthy activities can be seen as making their lives meaningful. So we can think of Mother Teresa and, Genghis Khan. Yes, both of them, according to this theory, which I think is not strong enough, were moved ultimately, let us accept for now, let us grant, by egoistic urges to feel good with themselves. The fact that Mother Teresa felt good with herself when she saved people's lives, and Genghis Khan felt good with himself when he murdered people, is a big, important difference. This is what makes her a good person and him a bad person.
Yeah.
She had a meaningful life, and he didn't.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, at the end of the day, the behavior, the act that one's doing is ultimately can bring meaning, even if for oneself that there's some personal satisfaction in it. And I'm thinking about just like a kiss, right? Like people don't usually kiss somebody because it's unpleasant for them to give the kiss. It's usually pleasant, but they're also usually interested in how the kiss is affecting the other person. There's multiple things going on there that's making it a enjoyable and meaningful thing, not just one. And I really like looking at it that way. It's just, again, another way of looking at meaning as more flexible and nuanced and gray than just sort of a black and white.
Yeah, this is very instructive, I think. The kiss example is very helpful, I think.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about increasing meaning in one's life. You talk a little bit about that in the latter chapters of your book. And there are some ways in which people, if they wanted to look at meaning and increase that for themselves, that are helpful ways to go about that. Like, one are in some of the work that you've done in examining this, what do you find are ways that are helpful for people?
Well, I think that people can gain very much if they try to increase meaning in their lives. Some people say my life is not meaningful and then do nothing. And it's odd because if the faucet is not working, they try to fix it. Yeah. And this is also what we should do with life's meaning. And to know what to do, I think that there are various questions that we can ask ourselves. One of them is just asking the plain question, what would make my life more valuable or meaningful? This is a simple, straightforward question to ask.
Yeah.
And for some, the reply to this question is enough. And another question we might ask ourselves is, what elements in my life do I already take to be meaningful? And increasing the degree of elements that I already take to be meaningful often will increase meaning. It will help me identify what is already meaningful and what is helpful for me. And a third question, I think also very important, is to ask ourselves what should be removed from my life in order to make it more meaningful. And this question focuses on negative value. And it is important because I think that many things that are not working well in people's lives have to do with what we need to stop doing, not only with things that we have to start doing or do more. As in health or in love, an important part of what we need to do to improve does not involve adopting new behaviors, but refraining from old ones, or at least moderating them. And the fourth question, I think, that can be helpful is to ask ourselves what characteristics of other people's lives lead us to consider their lives as meaningful lives, or what do we respect and appreciate in other people's lives. In my case, for example, when I felt that my life is not sufficiently meaningful, I asked myself, well, whose lives do I take to be really, really highly meaningful? Mm-hmm. And I'm a philosopher, so the names that came up first were names of philosophers like Aristotle or Plato or Immanuel Kant. But then it occurred to me that the people whose lives I take to be really meaningful, very meaningful, are people like, I know, Mother Teresa or Albert Schweitzer and people like that. And then I understood that maybe in order to make my life more meaningful, I should follow the latter example. I should try to do some philanthropic work. And I took a course that instructed me how to accompany terminally sick cancer patients to their deaths. And I helped them. And that made a huge difference for me. And then I think another helpful question is to to ask what worked for others and ask other people. And then there is the deathbed question. Suppose that I were on my deathbed and I had the presence of mind and time to look back on my life, what would I be happy or sorry to have done or not to have done? And I can think of this question as relating to my life in general, and but also to relating to limited units of time. If I'm thinking about spending the next hour or week or year in a certain way, it might be interesting for me to ask myself, what on my deathbed would I think about this week or hour or year?
Yeah.
These things also help people, I think, to identify what might make their lives more meaningful.
Yeah. That also comes up quite a bit in psychotherapy when people are talking about meaning. And what I often do with patients is have them take a look and say, like, okay, you're 45 years old right now. Let's imagine 30 years passes and you're now 75 years old. What do you think if you were to look back with regret? That's sort of a variation on the theme of the deathbed, right? Because regret is always a sad thing to see in psychotherapy. If you were to look back in your life or regret because you didn't accomplish this thing or do this thing that was important to you, and again, not necessarily goal-oriented, but the journey of doing it, what would that be? And that is often a very, very helpful way for a person to develop some insight. So I think that is a really important thing to reflect upon.
Yeah. Again, it's so interesting to see the commonalities between psychology, psychotherapy, and philosophy.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, you talked a bit about Mother Teresa, and you've talked a bit about helping others and doing things that reduces suffering from others and making life better for them. That's often things that come up that help people develop a sense of meaning. And I understand that. You also talked about something, though, in your writing that I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about that I thought was pretty fascinating. And this is idea, you call it the Strickland model. It's based on, it was on some novel, you can remind us, but it's this idea that, like, when people are feeling this lack of meaning in life, of just dropping everything and radically changing everything, and that's the way to find the meaning. And we see this in movies too, right? The person who lived in the corporate job and had the husband and decided, like, okay, this isn't what I want to do, so I'm going to sell everything and move to India and be in an ashram. And I'm just wondering, like, what do you have to say about this Strickland model in terms of in the context of finding meaning?
Yes, I think we should be very cautious with this Strickland model. The model takes its name from a character in Somerset Maugham's book, The Moon and the Sixpence. And this person, Charles Strickland, I think his life more or less follows in a very loose way the life of the painter Paul Gauguin. So Strickland is a London stockbroker, and one day he leaves his work and family completely and becomes a painter in Paris and severs all ties with his family and with his previous environment. And after some time in Paris, he moves to Tahiti and continues to paint until he dies, and his pictures become masterpieces. And this is a very influential model, a very romantic one. I think it's the secular analog of the complete mystical or religious conversion that leads one to be some kind of a born again or see the light.
Yeah.
And it is characterized by a few qualities. One of them is a radical break with the past. A radical break. I mean, nothing continues.
Yeah.
And people do not make local improvements on what they have. They do not mend, but a complete revolution. And another characteristic is that the change is very abrupt. It is also frequently irreversible. And it usually focuses on one issue, and it is strongly committed to no less than excellence. And I think that there are many disadvantages to that. Because this romantic model focuses on radical changes, it is highly demanding and thus may cause some people to give up trying to change at all. It dissuades them from making small or gradual changes that they could have opted for with a lot of gain. I very strongly believe that small changes can be huge changes.
Yeah.
Sometimes you change the size of your shoe only by half a number and the blisters go away and you stop limping.
When I started wearing glasses, that was one of those changes.
Right.
Yeah.
And another disadvantage is that due to the model's commitment to wholesale changes, it also carries high probability of failure.
Mm-hmm.
So it's again an all or nothing
Yeah.
solution, if it is a solution, with all the disadvantages of all or nothing. And since it is the Strickland model is committed to a radical break with the past, the model is completely blind to the worth of what we already have.
Yeah.
And therefore, we just throw away many things that might be good, and with some amendments or developments, we could have continued to have them, improved them, mended a few things, and life would have been good. And the abruptness endorsed by the model does not allow us to experiment by trial and error with a new situation. For example, painting 4 hours a week in one's hometown. You just have to leave everything and go to Tahiti or Paris. I think also that the Strickland model is frequently based on an incorrect view of what needs to be changed. Just as when we're hungry, we sometimes feel that the only thing that we want is to eat, and we want to eat huge quantities of food, and we'd always want to eat. So it might be that the person is, hungry for art, let us say. This is something that interests them. And this frequently can be satisfied with smaller amounts or degrees of engagement with art. And the radicality of the Strickland model, I think, is very dangerous. And I saw quite a few people who tried to make their not sufficiently meaningful lives more meaningful, which is good, but in that wrong way, following that over-romantic and romanticized model. I think it's much better to do it in a more moderate way with trial and error and with caution, and to try to endorse the valuable and meaningful aspects that our lives already have and expand on them or add to them other sources of meaning.
You talk about another important point that you notice when you're thinking about this concept of meaning for people. And it's recognizing this gap between people's expectations and reality, that there's sort of a disconnect there, and that can create problems for assessing meaning. What do you mean by this?
Well, I think that this is somewhat related also to the notion of perfectionism. Some people have very high norms or expectations, and I think overly high norms and expectations. And therefore, there is a gap between the way their lives are and the way they feel that their lives should be. Now, these gaps are commonplace in life, and we can do various things with them. We can try to enhance reality so it would be closer to the expectations. And we can also, in some cases, when the expectations are unrealistic, we should try perhaps to decrease or to lower our expectations to make them more realistic and plausible. And we sometimes can also live with some tension or some gaps, say that it would have been nice, perhaps, if things were better, but that's the way things are. And I also see the great value in what there already is. But I think that almost all people that feel that their lives are meaningless have this gap between what they take reality to be and what their expectations are. And this leads to many expressions that people use, or maybe ways in which people describe their feeling that life is meaningless. So sometimes they say that the thing is that there's something wrong. And I think the wrongness has to do with this gap. I mean, life should have been this way and it is that way. And some people say that the whole thing is a farce or a bad joke. And farces or jokes are, of course, deviant from the way things should be. When I tell a joke, the joke describes things that are not the better way or the best way that it should be. I think this is true of many other descriptions of life's meaning. Sometimes also people talk about a deception, a big lie, an unfulfilled promise, as if they were promised that life would be a certain way, but now it's not that way. And once we understand that there is this gap, we can think about ways of either enhancing reality or perhaps lowering a bit our expectations so they would be plausible. Yeah. Or maybe doing both at the same time, and we can also live with some gap, I think.
Well, once again, you're touching upon another thing that happens quite a lot in psychotherapy, is recognizing that a lot of people's unhappiness with their lives comes from expectations that are not realistic, and trying to have a person be able to bring those expectations more into a realistic realm, and then figuring out ways to change things to meet those expectations or to come closer toward the middle. So I think that is really, really important in a psychotherapy context.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah, this has been a really fascinating conversation, and it's been great to have you on the show talking about these concepts and topics related to meaning. I'm just wondering if there's any final thoughts that you'd like to talk about or anything else on your mind to leave us with today.
Maybe two things. One of them is I think to be aware of one's perfectionism when it comes to life's meaning and in general, which leads also to black and white and those other mistakes. Yeah. And I think that another general suggestion, which I also suggest to myself and to other people sometimes, is that, well, don't be cruel to yourself. And I think that sometimes people are cruel to themselves when it comes to meaning in life, maybe in other cases as well. We, I think, should be nice to other people and encouraging and good parents and good friends, but also to ourselves. So cruelty is usually a bad thing, one of the worst things. Yeah. And we're also persons and we shouldn't discriminate against ourselves. So we shouldn't be cruel to ourselves. And it's very important, I think, to remember also that.
Yes, very wise words. Iddo, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I'm very happy to have been here, and I learned quite a lot from our discussion.
Me too. Shalom.
Shalom and kol tuv. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Mind Tricks Radio. I hope you have enjoyed the program. For more information about Mind Tricks, you can go to my website, www.waikikihealth.com. Be sure to subscribe to Mind Tricks on your preferred podcasting host to be notified of new episodes of Mind Tricks. Please take some time to give Mind Tricks a good rating and review wherever you're listening. It really helps get the word out to new listeners. And please like and share Mind Tricks posts on Twitter and Facebook by following your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan.